Part 2. Making Pharaoh. 3200 to 3000 BC. 9. Scorpion and Hawk. 3200 to 3000 BC. For the best part of its journey, the Nile flows northwards to the sea. There is a passage, though, in Upper Egypt, where it strikes sharply to the east and curves back again in 3/4 of a circle to round a desert plateau, known now as the Ghana Bend. This 100-mile detour passes through the better part of the Naqadan heartlands, and past many of ancient Egypt's most celebrated sites. From Thebes downstream to Naqada, Coptis, and Dendera, and on to Nag, Hammadi and Abydos. Cutting this considerable voyage by half, a series of ancient tracks strike directly north and west from Thebes across the desert plateau to Naqada and Abydos, and thus complete the circle of the curving Nile. Today, these ancient highways pass over a beautiful if bleak high plain, where you may occasionally see small caravans bringing chunks of raw alabaster to the Luxor tourist workshops, or herds of camels being driven north to the Cairo markets by white-clad Nubians cracking silver-handled whips. 5 millennia ago, this limestone desert still held sufficient moisture to support communities living as their ancestors had done, by herding, hunting, and gathering and grinding wild wheats and grasses. But then the plains had slowly dried and, as the ancient pottery beside the narrow track still shows, they were only used by parties of desert travelers. Some of the caravanners left drawings and texts on the limestone cliffs beside these desert tracks. From their ineptness, we may assume that the best part of them were not the work of draftsmen, but had been scratched in a moment using one of the flints that lie all around upon the surface of the desert. Amongst this multilingual babble of names and titles, dates and prayers and family trees of which such graffiti are usually composed, there is an especial treasure, drawn in a little shelter that overlooks a well-trod path as it twists left and right to rise up from a wadi bed and gain the top of a limestone terrace. Set in vertical and horizontal strips, this rare graffito holds a series of some 16 separate images: birds and snakes, a scorpion, a bull's skull set upon a post, and some human figures, one of which appears to clasp a club in one hand and a rope in the other, to which is tied, in the manner of the image in the painted tomb at Hierakonpolis, a trussed-up prisoner. Drawings similar to several of these distinctive images have been found within the Nile Valley in archaeological contexts, so the graffito can be fixed into prehistory with a degree of confidence. These signs were drawn, it would appear, in the 3rd quarter of the 4th millennium BC, the same period, that is, in which some of the elaborately decorated palettes appear to have been made. And here, too, though the quality of this graffito is worlds apart from those miniature masterpieces, its images are organized in lines, one following another, in the manner of a cylinder seal's impression. And this in turn suggests that, like with figures drawn on the palettes and the ivories, the rows of signs in this graffito were also intended to hold some kind of linking narrative. Was it, then, like many later ancient Egyptian desert graffiti, intended to register or advertise a human presence in an empty place? Or does its setting in a rock shelter on a track between Naqada and Abydos suggest that it was made as a kind of notice? 400 miles to the south, in Nubia and well beyond all trace of Naqadan settlement, a similarly drawn graffito was scratched up on a rock that overlooked the Nile's second cataract, an image of a scorpion dangling a trussed man between his enormous claws, with 2 other figures standing close by, one of which held a bow and arrow aimed straight at the scorpion's helpless prisoner. Now, both of these graffiti appeared to hold a common theme of subjugation, and both were placed outside the Naqadan homelands, in potentially strategic positions. That they contain the image of a scorpion may even suggest that they referred to groups of people, or even an individual, who was identified by that alarming creature. That one of the earliest known images of a person dressed as a pharaoh also has the image of a scorpion beside it, indeed, might even suggest that these 2 graffiti record the names of prehistoric kings. The 2 graffiti may, therefore, memorialize an event or stand as a kind of warning, and if that were proven, they would transform these two rough drawings into some of the oldest known documents of ancient Egyptian history. These images, after all, were inscribed centuries before the age of the first known pharaohs and the oldest known hieroglyphics. Those rows of images, perhaps, might represent a form of proto-writing. The wine-rich tomb. In 1989, German archaeologists working in the desert cemeteries of Abydos came across an enormous tomb which had been made in the same period as the two graffiti, a tomb that, though already plundered and half emptied by earlier expeditions, still held part of its original grave goods and further evidence of the beginnings of hieroglyphic writing. Somewhat prosaically, the archaeologists christened the tomb Tomb J, that is, in Cemetery U. A flimsy, brick-built rectangle some 33 feet long and 27 wide. The tomb had been set into the side of a low, hard sand dune and was the largest of a group of similar monuments that were, essentially, a series of architectural elaborations of the older and simpler two-roomed graves, like the painted tomb at Hierakonpolis. Here though, in the tomb Uj, the Naqadans continuing urge to embellish and enlarge had transformed a modest grave chamber with a single screening wall into what appeared to have been a near full-size replica of the rooms and storerooms of a grand household. This impression was fortified in the course of its excavation by the surviving grave goods that still lay in the tomb's 10 chambers, stores of food and drink, fragments of rare stones, ivory, obsidian and gold, splinters of exotic fine-worked woods and some bulks of flooring timber which, carbon-14 measurement has shown, fixed the date of their deposition in the tomb within 100 years or so, to around 3200 BC. An extravagant continuance of the age-old Naqadan custom of burying victuals with the dead. At least 2 of Uj's tomb chambers had served as cellars where more than 4,500 liters of wine had once been stored, decanted into trading jars, made in the manner of the South Levant and closed with lids and cords and mud. Bearing the impressions of Naqadan seals, the wine had been flavored with Levantine resin and those circular strings of figs that are still sold in Mediterranean markets, whose ancestors the archaeologists found inside the jars. Many of these jars were found exactly as the burial party had left them, stacked up some 6 feet high, from floor to ceiling. Considerable quantities of typical Naqadan storage jars had been piled up inside the tomb as well, robust cylindrical containers that, presumably, had once been filled with local foodstuffs, ointments, perfumes, oils and animal fats. And many of these local wares bore painted images similar to the signs in the two rock graffiti, a dozen flamboyant renderings of a bull's head set up on a post and some 60 lively drawings of scorpions. At first glance, then, the objects in this palatial crypt appeared to put some flesh on the shade of a hypothetical prehistoric ruler, a proto-king, perhaps, named Scorpion especially when some ivory fragments from the tomb's largest room, which was probably its burial chamber, were reassembled into a stubby staff, reminiscent of a scepter of the later pharaohs. Had King Scorpion lived, however, he would have had to share his vague era with a host of other hazy monarchs, for many objects made at this time that have been found in excavations all up and down the valley of the lower Nile bear similarly evocative images of crocodiles, elephants and hawks. So, in an odd-toed ordering of later history, Petrie dubbed the last centuries before the coming of the kings as Dynasty Zero. Thus, these theoretical monarchs were demoted to the role of local Naqadan princes named after animals, who squabbled amongst themselves, for to many modern eyes images of bound and threatened captives are the products of a war. And then, with just a few small words, modern linguistics seemingly consolidated the identities of these phantom princes by translating several of their image names as if they were the same as later hieroglyphs, and the daddy warriors took on such names as Ka and Jet and even King Nhr and King H3.T. Hr, though not, it should be emphasized, King Uj. Once again, however, We're sailing on the seas of our imagination. 4. Though several of these prehistoric images appear to resemble later hieroglyphs, it is a considerable leap to assume that these same signs are the names of individual rulers. The images, for example, that were drawn on the sides of the storage jars found in the tomb Uj at Abydos might just as well refer to the vessel's contents, or their owners, or a location where the goods were made or packed or processed. Such images, indeed, may have held meanings as indeterminate as a painted flame upon the bonnet of a motor car, or as complex as a figure on a cross. And so, of course, the prehistoric kings are equally indeterminate. Their totem names of scorpion and hawk derived from 19th century tribal anthropology rather than the era of the ending of prehistory. Similar images, indeed, were made centuries before the era of the rock graffiti in the tomb Uj. A splendid series of scorpion sculptures, for example, minor masterpieces in translucent Egyptian alabaster that vividly encapsulate the texture and color of the living creature, were deposited in early Naqadan tombs in the Great Wadi at Hieroglyphics, and images of hawks were left in those same tombs as well, all beautifully carved from lumps of lapis lazuli that flash like the plumage of the living bird. And yet the evidence is tantalizing. Clearly, it is likely that some of the images and signs made in the last centuries before the first kings, and which resemble the later hieroglyphics, held meanings beyond those of the objects they immediately portray. What that meaning may have been, however, in this most tender age, when the offices of the pharaonic state and its arts and writing were still centuries away, is as yet impossible to know. One thing, though, is certain. If these archaic images are translated, as if they were terms in standard hieroglyphic dictionaries and treated as fragments of traditional history, all they will ever provide is another chapter in a 19th century history book with an added pinch of primitivism, the same old plots that animate totem kings named hawk and scorpion leading mythic armies on Napoleonic marches that are measured by the geographic span of their graffiti. Which, of course, is why so much ancient history writing is, of itself, something of a relic, and why the phenomenal originality of prehistoric Egypt has been so obscured. What a breath of fresh air, then, when social science promises a modern history of ancient Egypt's true beginnings. Not Dynasty Zero with its totem princes, but what Norman Yaffe has described as several categories of intersocietal interaction, diffusion/migration models, which may include warfare, economic models, including colonial, imperial, and world systems, approaches, and symbolic/ideological models. Read on, however, and, curiously enough, the same old ghosts still haunt this icy rhetoric, which effectively sets prehistory within the same old savage narratives, with phantom principalities vying for territorial, social, and ideological control. Archaeology, refreshingly, shows no evidence of that whatever, no layers of ashen burnt-out dwellings, no fallen fortress walls in the era of the phantom princelings. Nor do any of the bodies in the cemeteries of the period show signs of combat or evidence of military training, nor is there any trace of a warrior class or cult, or of the development of weaponry, no grave goods at all that could be classed as military, beyond the traditional accoutrements of hunting. Nor are there any sudden changes in the material culture of the period, whose surviving relics reflect the lengthy span of slow and steady change before, during, and after the appearance of the first pharaohs. Petrie's sequence dating system, for example, shows no evidence of that considerable event, arguably the greatest single happening in ancient Egyptian history, which took place some 2 centuries after the burial in the tomb Uj. Where then, does the evidence of this history reside? 10. The coming of the king. The origins of hieroglyphs, circa 3000 BC. The earliest known evidence of an Egyptian pharaoh was found at Hieroglyphics in 1897 by one of Petrie's key assistants, James Quibell, who had been assigned to excavate the sprawling site to rescue its antiquities from looting. Quibell was assisted in the work by Frederick Green, another young Englishman working for the British administration of Egypt, on leave from the Government Survey Department. And it was Green who, following Quebel's departure to take up a post in the administration's service de Antiquité, compiled the field notes that provide the best part of our information about one of archaeology's most significant discoveries. Quebel first chose to work in the desert wadi where more recent excavations have located traces of Naqadan houses, potteries, stockyards and cemeteries, pocked by illegal digging and long since mined by local farmers for the fertilizing properties of desert shale and the dust of deep antiquity. The wreck of that great wide plain seems to have quickly discouraged the two Englishmen, who turned their work gangs to excavate a compact ancient mound, the so-called Hill of Naqadan, which lay in the fields below the wadi in the desert plain. 50 years earlier, before its sandstone blocks were carried off to serve as the foundations of a factory in a nearby town, the ruins of a little temple had stood upon that hill. And it was there, in the footings of a vanished temple, by the remnants of a prehistoric shrine, that Quebel and Green uncovered a vast agglomeration of courtly objects, a cache such as had not been seen before and has never since been equaled in all of Egypt, a pair of beautiful life-sized pharaonic statues made of sheets of beaten copper, a golden image of a hawk with glittering obsidian eyes still standing in its ancient shrine, two splendidly engraved cosmetic palettes, some prehistoric slaughtering knives, a remarkable collection of stone vases, a heap of mace heads piled like potatoes, some of which were vividly engraved in a manner similar to the cosmetic palettes. And in amongst all this, suffused by groundwater and penetrated by the roots of thorn and halfa grass, lay a mass of ivories which, Quebel remarked, resembled potted salmon, but on inspection proved to be hundreds of separate and delicately carved objects from the time of the first kings, but which were so cemented and decayed that they are still under restoration to this day. The excavation of these treasures continued over 2 long seasons, Green only briefly venturing out of the temple precincts during the second year to excavate the famous painted tomb that lay close by and which, so his workmen loyally informed him, had recently been found by dealers and was in the process of being looted. Caught as he was between 2 different jobs, Quebel's publication of the finds was scanty. Green's working notebooks, however, made clear that the temple cache had been deposited in 3 main groups. The first included the 2 unparalleled copper statues that had been made some 7 centuries after the first pharaohs, and the golden hawk, which was probably of the same period. The second was composed of a mass of figurines and other objects made mostly during the first 2 centuries of the Egyptian kings, while the third, more varied in its contents and even rarer than the others, included the engraved mace heads and the 2 siltstone palettes, one of which, at a little over 25 inches, is the largest palette known to have survived, and which also spells out the name in hieroglyphs of a king called Narmer, the king now recognized as the first of all the pharaohs. What gives the third group of the cache a unique significance is that it was found in a single sealed context and included objects from both the last anonymous phases of prehistoric Naqadan culture, the times of the Phantom Princes, and the beginning of ancient Egyptian history. In contrast, and as we have already seen, most of the other fine objects from that most crucial era were plundered from the ancient sites by dealers, and thus remain unprovenanced, undatable and so outside of history. This third group also contained most of the surviving evidence of the invention of the office of Pharaoh, set out in fine relief on some of the decayed ivories and engraved in stone upon 3 mace heads in the palette with King Narmer's name. The office is defined in a group of related scenes and images that coalesce in a single figure wearing the exact accoutrements of later pharaohs. Crowns, sticks, maces and the distinctive royal dresses, a figure which is larger than the others, that sits on thrones and is accompanied by body servants and standard bearers and, in the instance of King Narmer, is identified, in hieroglyphs, by name. On all these objects, both the king and the images of other smaller figures are drawn and posed in the distinctive manner in which the later artists of Pharaonic times would invariably compose the human figure, set out on little lines an inch or so in length. Some of the tiny groups of figures appear to show a royal gathering with trussed-up and mutilated captives, others, the king enthroned and holding court in the manner of the later drawings on the picture plaques of ivory and wood. Another group shows Pharaoh in the guise of birds and bulls and catfish, who are identified as king by the ornaments of royal office. Many of these vivid compositions are aggressive and show Pharaoh in the act of execution, attacking trussed-up captives or breaking down the bricks of walled enclosures. There are as well some disembodied images grouped together in the manner of Egyptian hieroglyphics, a few of which, on Narmer's palette, phonetically spell out the royal name. To Kubel and Green and their contemporaries, it must have seemed as if ancient Egypt had stepped fully clothed out of the prehistoric mist. Interpretations. In 19th century terms, such apparently inexplicable cultural revolutions were usually ascribed to the arrival of a race of intelligent foreigners in boats, to the mind of an individual genius, or to the mysterious workings of the deity. Even these days, though they have largely dispensed with embarrassing theories of colonization, traditional historians are apt to describe the era in which Pharaoh and ancient Egyptian culture make an abrupt and simultaneous appearance in phrases such as an age of miracles, and to portray the simultaneous arrival of the first written name as a dazzling intellectual leap. Underlying all such interpretations, even those that propose invasion as a main mover, is the common academic assumption that thought in words necessarily precedes all actions, specifically, in the case of ancient Egypt, that a clever person or some sort of prehistoric brain stress had thought the whole thing up, and then told a studio of humble craftsmen to delineate a set of symbols that would express their ideas in some kind of a curiously abstruse visual code. Not all people, however, act, as a philosopher once put it, from the opinions that they hold about things, nor is there the slightest evidence that pharaonic imagery was created to symbolize abstract thoughts or even oral traditions, nor, most certainly, the comfortable saws and maxims that are so often trotted out in explanation of the pharaohs and their gods. Given that it took close to half a millennium after Narmer's name was first inscribed to compose a hieroglyphic phrase or sentence, and yet further centuries for the first recorded hieroglyphic literature to be written out, there hardly seems to have been a rush to publication, no burning need to record imaginary intellectual deliberations. In those exact same centuries, however, before the hieroglyphs were put to literary use, they were themselves exquisitely refined, and huge amounts of care and effort were employed in their emplacement upon monumental blocks of stone. The notion, then, that hieroglyphs were created to record human thought or speech is absurd. Something different was happening. In the words of Colin Renfrew, ancient Egypt was one of those cultures in which the symbol in its real, actual substance, actually preceded the concept. At first glance, this might seem a rarefied idea. In reality, it is a universal mode of comprehension and creation. The present Queen Elizabeth, for example, attained her rank by the assumption of a crown, a cloak and a scepter during the rites of coronation, an event whose qualities the written word lacks the capacity to encapsulate. In modern media, as well, known literary discourse is king, most obviously in entertainment and in advertising, where complex narratives are meticulously composed and swiftly transmitted in such media as music, color, clothes and lighting. Nor are such communication systems limited in their capacity for argument or expression. Mere words, indeed, no longer compete with the universal fascination of the modern media. On the origins of hieroglyphics, that the age of Narmer was often hailed as an age of miracles is because so many far-reaching changes in Naqadan society, the advent of kings, the ancient Egyptian style of drawing and, above all, hieroglyphic writing, seemed to arrive together and at once. In earlier centuries, it appeared, these things were quite unknown. Then, suddenly, around 3000 BC, identified by crowns and costumes. Images of a specific king appeared whose royal name was spelled out in a group of 3 small signs, a house, a fish and an engraving chisel. This, though, is largely an illusion. In reality, the metamorphosis that enabled the identification of King Narmer, the process, that is, of expanding the meaning of those 3 small images, of freeing them from the things they pictured, had been 1,000 years and more in its development. As in more recent histories, once the necessary elements were all in position, change was very rapid. As far as Pharaoh's Egypt is concerned, an early part of that long slow journey towards identifying kings was held in the gesture that had pressed an ivory comb into a knot of hair at an early Naqadan funeral. Many of those pretty combs sport images of animals on their tops, the silhouette of a gazelle, say. Images that when attached to a human head change the aspect of that person in much the same way as the craftsman's cutting out the image of a gazelle on a comb had previously changed the nature of the comb itself. Here, then, a lively, idiosyncratic image had twice been placed in settings where it imparted extra shades of meaning. Freed from its immediate context, the dainty desert antelope had begun to move in the Naqadan imagination. Such images, of course, hold considerable subtleties, which, as Claude Lévi-Strauss once observed, can be very good to think with. A further stage in the journey was uncovered by the excavators of the tomb at Abydos who, along with other melancholy mementos of that once splendid burial, found 200 modest plaques of ivory and bones still lying in the tomb. Smaller than postage stamps, each of these tiny plaques had been vividly engraved with a few signs taken from a basic repertoire of 40 images. Some of which, scorpions, elephants and hawks, a bull's head on a staff dash. Already a considerable Naqadan pedigree, and which were also drawn on other objects found within the tomb. Each of these little plaques had been snapped from larger sheets of ivory and bone that had been scored with deep grooved lines, their signs appearing to have been drawn out before the plaques were separated. Each plaque also had a hole drilled in a corner above the engraved signs, which would have allowed a cord to have passed through the plaque so that its images would have served as a kind of label. Like the antelope comb, the little images upon the plaque had served to modify the identities of the objects to which they were attached. Unfortunately, the signs engraved on these little plaques are not the same as those of the later hieroglyphic repertoire, which are as specific in their identities and forms as are the letters of the Roman alphabet. They may not, therefore, read like Narmer's name nor, indeed, like many of the signs engraved upon the later, larger picture plaques. Nonetheless, the rules of the game are plain enough to see, for the standardization of the label's 40-odd signs shows that their makers were working within a well-developed system, whilst all the labels' images are well ordered and facing in the same direction, which lends them the formal qualities of later hieroglyphic text, a visual linking narrative. These same rules, the syntax of these images, would later guide the construction of the first hieroglyphic text and, indeed, announce the coming of a king named Narmer. As for the specific meaning of the signs on the labels from the tomb they do not seem to have identified the contents of objects to which they were attached, not, that is, unless they were attached to the like of elephants and bulls' heads. Nor indeed do they appear to have been elements of a previously unknown phonetic writing system that was later discarded in favor of pharaonic hieroglyphs. What is familiar, though, amidst all this uncertainty, is the lines and curls that accompany these tiny images, for in later hieroglyphic writing, the same forms will denote the numbers 1 and 100 and here, too, as in the later texts, these signs appear in combinations that seem to represent a single complex number, which, in the manner of Roman numerals, can be calculated by counting up the duplicated signs. And later, pharaonic funerary texts, quantities of woven textiles, a significant item of grave furnishings, are listed and numbered in exactly this same way. These plaques, therefore, may be early examples of a traditional accounting system. And if that were true, their images may have identified a product, a person, a community, or workplace. Bull's head wine from the Elephant Ridge estate? At all events, it is a reasonable certitude that the two signs that spell out the syllables of Narmer's name upon the siltstone palette can be identified as belonging to a king by their containment within a rectangular patterning of lines, known now as a Surik, a highly specific image which, for the following 3,000 years, would be used to hold one of the 5 names of Pharaoh. Later, and more elaborated representations of the sign show that it represents the great house, the para, as it is spelled out in the later hieroglyphs, which is the origin of our word Pharaoh. Here, then, on Narmer's palette the 3 little signs together would appear to signify the royal house of Narmer. Inside the regal Surik, the sound of the 2 signs that compose Narmer's name have been rendered in the same way as hieroglyphic signs are in later hieroglyphic inscriptions, the bewhiskered catfish Nar, and the chisel mare below it, making up the name Narmer. It is assumed, therefore, that those 2 images were carved to represent the ancient voice, the ultimate abstraction of Naqadan imagery which had begun when the craftsman had created a visual taxonomy of Nilotic flora or fauna. Sadly, however, the genuine ancient sound of Narmer's name is almost gone, those 2 syllables having undergone, along with those of all the other hieroglyphs, what a distinguished linguist recently described as a complex history of loss, assimilation and reacquisition. At the least, the sound of their vowels is as yet unknown, so that the name represented by the catfish and a chisel has been variously rendered as Narmer, Normer, Marinari, Wigmer, Narbatai, or on occasion, plain old Nar the last abbreviated. Suggestion deriving from the fact that the image usually identified as the mare hieroglyph is shaped like a modern stone-cutting chisel is quite different from the image drawn on Narmer's palette, which, with its wooden handle, is more like an engraving tool, the literal means, in fact, of making Narmer's name in stone. Should therefore, the mare be abandoned, to leave us with King Nar? The adoption of another system of transcription, alternatively, one that takes into account the meanings of some of the other words in which Narmer's hieroglyphs appear, would provide our Pharaoh with an entirely different set of monikers, such as the angry/electric/furious/excellent/mean/cleaving/catfish. Whether any such interpretations are genuinely ancient, or are merely anthropological or linguistic concoctions, is presently beyond all knowing. Safer, therefore, to ensure that the pure products of old Egypt don't go completely crazy, to acknowledge that there are still huge uncertainties about such things, and that, like the names of Khufu, Ramses, and King Tut, Narmer is simply a convenient modern term for the hieroglyphs that distinguish the name of the first pharaoh. What actually survives, of course, behind these scholarly embroideries, all that is left from Narmer's time, are the heavy solid objects, the things themselves, the mace heads, the palettes and the ivories that hold scenes upon them which can still be read like music on a page or the impression of a rolling cylinder seal, a mass of images made centuries before the first known written phrase, that yet with hieroglyphic clarity announced the coming of the king. 11. Narmer's palette. The qualities of kings, circa 3000 BC. Of all the things Quibel and Green uncovered on the Temple Mount of Hierakonpolis, one object above all has come to represent the beginnings of ancient Egypt to the modern world. Frequently described, along with the Rosetta Stone and Tutankhamun's Golden Tomb as a landmark of Egyptian art and writing, King Narmer's palette has become a milestone of world history. It was probably inescapable. Narmer's is the largest palette known to have survived, and it is perfectly preserved, so, in a period when history is usually assembled from disparate collections of broken scraps, its purity and completeness hold a moment of perfect clarity. Nonetheless, King Narmer's palette's elevation to the status of world icon has had an unfortunate effect. shimmering enigmatically under its exhibition lights, the museum piece par excellence has been removed from all reality, set back into a living context. Though, within the ancient landscape amongst a mass of dusty broken things, this beautiful thin stone, its size, its weight, its gathered imagery, has two clear histories yet to tell. The first concerns its manufacture and design, the second, its role within contemporary court society. The material heritage is clear. Siltstone had been used for palettes since the times of the Badgerians, and, like all the other decorated palettes, the distinctive green-gray rock of which King Narmer's palette is composed appears to have been extracted from a single quarry about halfway along the Wadi Hammamet, a barren valley which runs through the hills of the eastern desert opposite Naqadan, to the port of Sir on the Red Sea coast. Mined from the times of the Pharaoh farmers to the Roman emperors, the quarry holds an extraordinary range of fine, hard rock, the heavy siltstone from which Narmer's palette was made being the raw material of some of Egypt's finest monuments. Apart from its strength and subtle color, the stone's great virtue for the ancient craftsman was certainly its near-perfect evenness of texture. The techniques they used to make King Narmer's palette were the same as those the craftsmen had developed in working on the earlier decorated palettes. First, the palette's outline was cut from a 2-foot slip of quarried stone, the craftsman following a traditional design of other decorated palettes and setting the silhouettes of animals along its upper edge to make a jagged line. Here, though, and uniquely, the outline of King Narmer's palette was given the characteristic oval shape of a large Naqadan storage jar. This flat, blank form, less than an inch in thickness, was then tapered, shaped, and smoothed so that the centers of both of its faces were forward of its edges. Next, it seems, a craftsman marked out the order and design of the subjects to be carved on both the palette's sides, for the finished work is designed with some precision, the palette's width, for example, being precisely 2/3 of its height. Then the outlines of the palette's images were cut into its two convex surfaces, each one defined with a series of tiny cuts around its edges and generous in detailed silhouette using a variety of copper chisels, points and flats. This work was then followed by a lengthy process of chiseling and abrading, in which the empty areas around each of the outline images were cut down and polished to a dull sheen so as to give the impression of a single lower surface, a ground from which the figures protrude in raised relief. This was an especially delicate procedure, in which the siltstone's innate strength allowed the sculptor to work parts of the thin slab to thicknesses of half an inch. Then, finally, after a great deal of detailed modeling and abrasion, a process in which the fine grain of the siltstone allowed the sculptor an exquisite level of control, a graphic outline was carefully drawn around each of the sculpted images with a tiny chisel point. That this final finishing, at the very least, was accomplished by a single person is suggested by some idiosyncratic details that are repeated time and time again on both the palette's surfaces, indeed, throughout all the work. The palette's very size would not have permitted more than one craftsman at a time to work upon it. Now, Naqadan copper chisels cannot mark siltstone in any way without a hammer's blow to drive a cutting edge gently into the stone, so this final process would have been drawn out by the continual necessity to resharpen the chisels. All the various processes of polishing and shaping the palette's figures, in fact, would have been similarly arduous and lengthy, using much harder and more powerful tools. A modern mason took 600 hours to make a replica. At the same time, however, the long processes of hand-working such a stone allowed the ancient craftsman time for care and thoughtfulness, so that the forms and textures of the figure's eyes and hands, the quality of hair and feathers and papyrus fronds, are delineated with a lively sensitivity and an extraordinary detail, just as they are on many of the other, older palettes, and that the overall composition of both the palette's faces are governed by a central vertical. Its designer follows the fundamental principles of the earlier decorated palettes. Unlike them, however, with their surfaces covered in dense and clever counterpoints of void and image, the figures on King Narmer's palette are set in relatively open spaces and held in lines between a series of horizontals, in the manner of a cylinder seal's impression. It is as if the Naqadan craftsman had sat down and unpicked a previously tangled rope and laid it out into carefully measured pieces. All the stress and dynamism of the older palettes, the graphic chaos of the hunt and battlefield, have disappeared. Isolated on an open ground, the crisp outstanding images of Narmer's palette occupy but a third of its total area, which, to the modern eye, provides them with a novel gravitas. This new way of composing images was a deliberate and long-considered choice. By itself alone, the work of smoothing down the open backgrounds with abrasive powders to obtain a texture similar to that of a baby's skin, a process that, as the tiny scratches on the stone betray, was accomplished with a range of abrasive powders, from coarse to smooth, was a considerable labor. It was a labor, though, that literally produced a newfound space. The presence of King Narmer fills these airy compositions. On earlier palettes, humans had appeared along with birds and beasts as one of many equal elements of a composition. Here, however, human figures have taken center stage, and their relative sizes have of themselves become an essential ingredient of the palette's imagery, King Narmer's images being 2 and 3 times larger than those of other people. And for the first time, too, one of the palette's faces is dominated by a single figure bestriding its ancient center line, the famous image of a smiting king. It is hardly surprising, then, that this preeminent museum piece stands as the contemporary icon of the beginning of pharaonic art. At the same time, however, the dark oval of the palette silhouette also encloses a range of ancient images, which have been gathered together for exactly the same purposes as that for which goods were assembled and placed in Naqadan graves throughout the previous millennium, for the purposes, that is, of constructing affiliation and identity for the body at their center. Here, however, for the first time, the body at the center is the large and lively image of a king, and in a dozen different ways. By hieroglyphs, by the use of scale and by the very images it holds, the diminutive officials, the royal maces, kilts and crowns, the scepters and the false tails and beards with which all pharaonic royalty will later be invested. The palette insistently and constantly identifies Narmer as a pharaoh. So on one face of his palette, Narmer wears a headdress that later hieroglyphic texts describe as the red crown and identify as the crown of the ruler of the regions known today as Lower Egypt, the region of the Nile, that is, that runs north from Memphis to the open sea. The first known occurrence of Phi's crown, however, was found in Upper Egypt, where it was drawn out centuries before the time of Narmer, on the side of a burnished pot with a blaze black rim. That the pot was recovered from the cemeteries of prehistoric Naqadan, close to some native sources of copper ore, might suggest that this crown may once have been made of thin sheets of that red shining metal. On the palette's other face, the figure of King Narmer is once again identified. By name, by size and by regalia, most obviously, on this occasion, by a tall headdress known as the white crown, which is commonly identified as the crown of Upper Egypt, the section of the Nile Valley that stretches south from Memphis to the first cataract at Aswan. Copied, so it has been suggested, from the designs of headdresses on some imported cylinder seals, the white crown appears to have been a more recent innovation than the red crown of Lower Egypt. In life, it may have been made of basketwork and plaster. Purposes and meanings. Why then, was this palette made? What purposes did its elaborate definitions serve? Was it an advertisement, a celebration of the making of a king, or was it made for other reasons? Like all the other elaborately decorated palettes, its ultimate purpose derived from the simple pigment grinding siltstone slabs of earlier ages. Indeed, a small circular pigment grinding dish is still present on King Narmer's palette, surrounded by 2 monsters, their necks and head entwined in the Mesopotamian manner. Above them are the figures of the king and court, inspecting 10 decapitated men. that images of hunting and fighting are the subjects of most decorated palettes has led to the plausible suggestion that they were made in preparation for these activities, because cosmetics appear to have been applied to their participants' faces before departing on such expeditions. That Narmer's palette shares some of its subject matter with the later ivory picture plaques and other records of specific royal events, however, has led to the further suggestion that all the decorated palettes were made for similarly specific happenings. In Narmer's case, this has traditionally been interpreted not as a hunting expedition, but as the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by force of arms, a narrative extended by 19th century historians, who took the scenes upon the palette to represent episodes of martial history. Nor, at first glance, does this seem impossible. At the bottom of one of the palette's faces, after all, there's an image of a bull trampling a man and breaking down an oval wall, whilst the same strip on the palette's other face holds two images of men who look over their shoulders as they run away, both sets of images that had been well rehearsed by figures set amidst the aggressive chaos of the older palettes. Given that Pharaoh himself will later be described as a great bull and is sometimes represented in the guise of powerful animals, it is most likely that the great bull on Narmer's palette is indeed an image of the king. The question yet remains, however, whether these images record a specific event or whether, as their ancestry suggests, they are simply a reworking of traditional compositions. Similar questions may be asked of the most elaborate of the palette's compositions that contain images of Narmer, some members of his court and the trussed-up bodies of 10 decapitated men. Do these also record a genuine event? Are they components of an episode of royal history? The classic answer to such questions has been given by the palette's largest single panel, which holds a 15-inch high image of King Narmer drawn in a pose derived from deep antiquity. Legs apart, with one arm raised, he is holding a kneeling man up by his hair and, in the age-old way, he is about to smite him with a mace. Above King Narmer's victim is a curious concoction of archaic signs, a complex image of a hawk with a human arm that holds a rope attached to a human head which is tethered by the nose, while the neck of the head, in turn, is attached to a particular oval shape from which rise 6 equal fronds of papyrus. Given that both the oval shape and a papyrus stem appear to correspond to the Egyptian hieroglyphs for the river Delta in 1000, this group has often been read along the lines of the hawk smites the Delta people, or Narmer takes 6,000 captives, or the hawk leads 6,000 captives. Recent archaeology, however, clearly contradicts these traditional interpretations, for it has proved that the northward movement of the Naqadan population into Lower Egypt began many centuries before the time of Narmer, and that it did not appear to have been accompanied by warfare. Nor is there archaeological evidence that Narmer the Hawk, or any other military force, conquered the Nile Delta. And at the same time, too, further research has provided explanations of the palette's purposes beyond that of advertising an illusory invasion. For Narmer's palette was found along with a host of objects that, as more recent archaeological discoveries have shown, were typical of the contents of contemporary shrines. And this in turn has led to a suggestion that its grinding dish was intended to supply pigment for the decoration of the figurines that were often housed in such shrines, some of which appear to have had some kind of makeup drawn around their eyes. If, the theory then continues, these palettes had been part of the equipment of such shrines, the presence of these elaborate reliefs inside such simple mud and wattle buildings may have been the root and inspiration of the reliefs carved in later Egyptian temples. Other objects from the cache of Hieroglyphics, however, suggest that Narmer's palette may also have served a more active function. For along with the Great Palette, the cache also contains some limestone mace heads that are as large as footballs, inflated, like King Narmer's palette, beyond all other known examples. They too were covered in scenes of royal ceremonial. In similar fashion, the cache also contained an enormous pair of slaughtering knives, the Largest work flints ever to have been excavated. Brittle and very heavy, at over 2 feet long, like the giant mace heads, these knives were hardly practical. Here, then, some of the traditional utensils of Naqadan society had been enlarged and transformed so that mace heads and long flint knives, the tools of ancient slaughter, had become powerful and archaic icons of some of the acts pictured on King Narmer's palette. Though larger than all other palettes and carved and polished so that its upper edges have the weighty quality of an engorged water skin, King Narmer's palette is nonetheless deceptively thin and thus conveniently light, whilst its tapered shape and carefully smoothed edges have clearly invited its being grasped in both hands along its lower edges, as ancient wear along them clearly shows. This suggests that it was designed for carrying, together, perhaps, with the giant knives and maces, those images of royal power, just as enlarged and highly decorated swords and maces are still carried in procession at parliaments and universities. Held high above the head, the palette's upper edges enlivened by the jagged outline of 2 silhouetted bullheads, King Narmer's Tariq, in archaic microchip upon a slaty circuit board, form the very sounds of Pharaoh's name. Was this, then, the presentation that Narmer's craftsman was working to achieve, an exhibition piece used in parade? Certainly the palette's careful images were designed to be read and understood, their balance and composure, a careful exercise in visual logic, laying out precisely and insistently the attributes and the identity of the new office that we now call Pharaoh. Nor did its every detail have to be open to immediate inspection. Like a great jeweled Bible carried in procession, the scenes on Narmer's palette hold their own wisdom, their own internal dialogues, their own tremendous potency, made as carefully as written words and designed to be read up close. It was enough that they were there. Amid images of suffering and death, the defining signs of kingship, courtly rank and hierarchy are laid out and ordered in precisely balanced compositions. Some have claimed, as we have seen, that such sufferings record genuine invasions, real wars. Archaeology does not support this supposition. In modern translations of many of the palette's signs are as yet uncertain, imprecise. What is certain, though, is that the images of Narmer's palette lay out the attributes, the qualities and the identity of pharaonic order, rather than merely documenting the earthly exploits of a single man, as in an ancient newsreel. Its craftsmen employed images far older than any text or written histories to display a novel governmental system and to offer in its balanced compositions stark recognition of, a meditation even, on the suffering required to maintain a social equilibrium within the new-made order. 12. The Hawk upon the Wall. History, Land, and Naqadan Resettlement, 3500 to 3000 BC. Though today we easily describe this Narmer as a king, as wearing crowns, and occupying the post we now identify as that of a ruler of all Egypt, in reality, of course, in Narmer's time there were no modern notions of a king or kingdom nor, indeed, in all pharaonic history would there ever be a denominating hieroglyph for Egypt, and so the very words we use give false voice to the people of the distant past. Nor was the concept of a nation-state with fixed borders and an ethnic identity a part of pharaonic Egypt. It is, of course, a creation of early modern Europe. Even those words that, a millennium later, pharaonic scribes occasionally used to define the ancient kingdom, such popularly quoted terms as Kemet - the Black Land - or Samatoi - the two/joined lands - were essentially poetic. More typically, when ancient Egyptian scribes referred to Pharaoh's kingdom in non-literary texts, they used terms like residence - that is, the royal residence, to denote the controlling center of the networks of trade and traffic, tithing and taxing, that operated in the regions of the Lower Nile. The assumptions that led traditional historians to capitalize the Black Land as if it were something other than a description of a cultivatable tract of earth beside the Nile, would have been entirely foreign to the early court of Egypt. So, just as there is no gene pool that may be described as ancient Egyptian, so there could never have been a unification of the land of Egypt. Given that span of the lower Nile was similar to that from Rome to Hamburg, it is unlikely that its various ancient inhabitants even spoke a common language. What then? Had Narmer's assumption of the two crowns actually signified? To European eyes, the tumbled ruins of old Egypt have long provided an obvious explanation. Pharaoh's shattered visage, after all, looks much like those of Roman emperors. So Narmer and his successors are enlisted as archaic representatives of a European narrative of history in which nations rise and fall. And everything is explained by drum and trumpet Darwinism. Pharaonic Egypt, however, was not just another version of those later histories, and had an entirely different tenor. In many ways, indeed, it was the antithesis of a modern nation-state. In no sense, for example, could ancient Egyptians be said to have been interested in the modern idea of progress. The maintenance of an ancestral order was a paramount objective. At the same time, the formation of Narmer's state had provided the foundations of a truly original order for society that would last for millennia, and which, as Pharaoh's Egypt, became a wonder of the ancient world. A byword for wisdom, piety and wealth. Certainly, the role of Pharaoh has clear elements in common with the many later kings who ruled by tradition and divine right. This is why, at first glance, a commonly used term like kingdom appears to be appropriate. Yet the pharaonic state stands at the beginning of all that. It was created from the ground up, without the benefit of an exemplar and, indeed, without the aid of writing or the presence of a national faith. Thus, it was made in an entirely different environment from those of subsequent states. Only centuries later, when the pharaonic state was well developed and cultural continuity established, did this unique creation find literary voice, and only then did the scribes examine and define their silent and already ancient kingdom and reflect its order in a mirror image and elaborate descriptions of a literary cosmos. By then, however, the moment of the state's creation, the making of the king and gods, had long since gone. Migrations. Setting aside traditional histories, the true origins of the pharaonic state lie in the middle of the 4th millennium BC, at the time, that is, when the first known images of wooden boats appeared and the Naqadans began to move out of their homelands and settle all along the valley of the lower Nile. At first the wooden boats appeared to have sailed right through the middle of Egypt, where the broad flood plains were suited to Naqadan farming, and settlements and cemeteries were founded both in the river's delta and in the narrow 50-mile strip of land between the ending of the Nile Valley and the latitudes of Lake Fayoum. In this region, Naqadan colonies became so large that, to Flinders Petrie, whose expedition had been the first to excavate them, it appeared that the core of the culture had itself shifted to the north. And so he dubbed this new and mobile phase of Naqadan prehistory Jersean, after some of the settlers' cemeteries which his staff had excavated by the little village of Gerza, just 40 miles south of Cairo. Like other Naqadan sites within this area, Gerza's cemeteries and settlements were set upon a rising desert plain above the west bank of the river, just as they had been in the Naqadan heartlands. Here, however, the river valley was only half as wide as in Upper Egypt, and in ancient times the western bank was exceptionally narrow. The ancient Nile was different from the modern river, too. Its flow much stronger than it would become in later phases of its history. In consequence, the beginning of the delta, where the vast, wide river broke into half a dozen different streams and spread out like a fan, was further south than it is at present, at a point where the valley cliffs nip close together near the pyramids of modern-day Saqqara. And it was there, within this narrowing plain, at the ending of the river's valley, where Naqadans had never lived before, that, in the last centuries before the reign of Narmer, they came to settle in there. Thousands. As the northern settlements grew in both size and number, the ancient cemeteries back in Naqada fell into disuse, so that, by Narmer's day, apart from a few alien mortuary monuments set at their edges and built apparently for Members of the royal family, they were accommodating hardly any burials at all. Nor did the later, non-royal graves contain splendid craftworks like those of earlier times. Ancient Naqadan, it appears, had descended into an obscure provincialism, which is probably why most of its magnificent prehistoric cemeteries had lain undisturbed beneath its gravelled plains until the ending of the 19th century. This was not the case throughout the rest of the Naqadan heartlands. Narmer himself would be buried at Abydos, along with his successors to the throne, in a most ancient desert cemetery that had earlier accommodated the wine-rich burial. In the tomb Uj at Hieroglyphs, as well, new cemeteries were established in the time of Narmer's successors, and several large impressive monuments were constructed. Add this archaeological evidence to the warlike scenes on the mace heads and the pallets, and it is easy to imagine that Abydos and Hieroglyphs had ganged up on Naqadan, impoverished that city, and marched northwards to control all of Egypt, and then, just as ancient Greek and Roman historians describe, had founded a fortress capital at the site of Memphis, a pharaonic metropolis of later era situated close by modern-day Saqqara. To traditional historians, the familial struggles of Horus and Seth, those great pharaonic deities, appeared as a reflection of these imaginary archaic wars, especially as two pharaonic temples were later dedicated to those same two deities at Hieroglyphs and Naqadan. And was not the very name of Memphis' greatest temple, Haikupta, transformed by the ancient Greeks into Aegyptos, and employed by them as the name for the entire kingdom? Translated into English, the word is literally Egypt. Had not ancient Egypt's history begun, therefore, within this mythic glooming? At first glance, Egypt's own records appeared to part confirm the story. For if Narmer had also been called Menes, and that is not impossible, as later pharaohs bore as many as 5 separate names, he may well have been the individual that some pharaonic king lists name as the first king, the same monarch that Greek and Roman texts describe as uniting Egypt by force of arms and founding its first capital at Memphis. What follows rests on the accounts given me by the Egyptians, which I shall now repeat, wrote the historian Herodotus in the 5th century BC. Unfortunately, Herodotus' story is little more than a recasting of a typical Greek tale about a heroic founder of a classical city, cities like those named after Alexander, cities that were not the products of population movements but had been established by acts of policy and deeds of engineering specifically to service the needs of trade and serve as naval bases. The story, too, is flatly contradicted by the excavation of a series of opulent and enormous late Naqadan cemeteries on both banks of the Nile in the region of ancient Memphis, which prove the Naqadans had been established in that area a century and more before the time of Menes/Narmer. And then again, despite extensive surveys, there is no trace of the archaic city that the heroic Menes is said to have founded, the dusty mounds of ancient Memphis that are visited by modern tourists being the residue of buildings of much later periods. Nor is there any trace of Menes in the contemporary record. Narmer's name, on the other hand, though it is never mentioned in later ancient Egyptian texts, nor in the tales of the Greeks and Romans, is common enough in excavations of the late Naqadan period, in lists of kings compiled in the reigns of his immediate successors insistently record his name as the first in the line of pharaohs. So the later ancient Egyptian historical records and the reports of the classical historians are simply not true, nor indeed are 19th century history books. Some of the other later ancient texts, however, now appear closer to the facts of modern archaeology. Wonderfully oblique writings inscribed on temple walls and on papyrus scrolls tell of the voyages of a god, a hawk named Horus, whose primordial progress was not that of a conquering and city-founding king, but is marked up and down the lower Nile by the establishment of shrines that in the following millennia would be transformed into some of ancient Egypt's grandest temples. The image of a hawk, of course, itself an ancient Naqadan sign, also appears upon the Narmer palette. Other near-contemporary images of the same bird were frequently drawn on storage jars and also appear as rock graffiti all along the Lower Nile and in the surrounding deserts. In later times, indeed, the name of the caravan route that joined the Nile Valley to the regions to the north of Egypt would be called the Way of Horus, the temple of the first Horus. So these textile was established at Hierakonpolis, the same site, that is, where Quibel in green had found an image of a golden hawk, sitting in the same pose as earlier Naqadan images of hawks that are drawn on the red painted jars, where they are shown perched on standards and riding on the wooden boats. It is indeed the voyages of that same distinctive image which these ancient texts seem to describe. So the hawk sailed upstream, 10 miles south of Hierakonpolis, to a site that is now the modern town of Edfu, where, so it is written on the high walls of that city's splendid temple, a special shrine was made for him. Though any archaic buildings that had once stood upon the venerable site have long been swept away or lie buried beneath the later temples, the texts tell how a perch was made from a split reed and planted in the silt at the river's edge, and that the golden hawk had settled there, and the mound where the perch had been set up was known as Horus Elevation, and an enclosure of precise dimensions with a central shrine 3 cubits wide was built to house the Edfu Horus, a literary description that tallies both with surviving models of archaic shrines and with images that are drawn on many of the picture plaques. Other texts tell of Horus shrines that were established downstream from Hierakonpolis and both the river's valley and its delta. Like the shrine of the Edfu Horus, the sites of some of the Horus shrines that were established in the Nile Delta are buried now, beneath such modern towns as Damanhor, whose name still defines the city as the settlement of Horus. Ancient Budo, too, is listed as one of the Hawk's foundations, whilst the locations of several similarly described Horus shrines within the delta are yet unknown and appear in ancient Egyptian funerary texts as lost in legendary cities. The greatest of all the northern Horus shrines was at Heliopolis, which now lies under Cairo's northern suburbs, though its surviving relics are few. Heliopolis is described in ancient literature as a grand religious center. In Heliopolis, so it was written, the Horus of the eastern horizon leaves its perch and takes wing every day, to rise in glorious confabulation with the sun god Re. As Re the Horus. In these later literary worlds, the dead of Hierakonpolis in the far south are united with those of Budo in the delta, known as the souls of P and Naqadan. The souls, that is, of Budo and Hierakonpolis, the two groups of spirit voyagers, appear as mysterious ecstatics in funerary texts where Pharaoh himself becomes a Horus. His courtiers are known as the followers of Horus, in all prehistory. The age, that is, before the coming of the kings, is glimpsed as a golden age, when history had not yet begun and the pharaonic state was ruled by gods. 13. Taking wing. Naqadan Emigration, 3500 to 3000 BC. Into the Delta. Until the 1980s, the immigrations from the Naqadan heartlands that would define the full extent of Pharaoh's kingdom and indeed the land of Egypt, were but little known or understood. A plethora of recent excavations has changed all that, however, some 15 flourishing Naqadan settlements having been discovered within the Nile Delta alone. Here then, in the region that would become the other half of ancient Egypt, the Southerners' distinctive pottery has recently been found in typically Naqadan graves set close to simple huts of daub and wattle. The Delta's indigenous populations, on the other hand, the people of the Mahdi Buddha culture, lived in relatively well-built settlements and made spare and simple graves that showed little of the Southerners' millennial preoccupation with the dead. Hints of what had encouraged the Naqadans to leave their narrow valley and voyage downstream into the wide and windy flatlands of the river's delta may yet be held in some of the region's ancient place names, which, as they are recorded in the language of the later hieroglyphs, are derived from such Levantine phrases as low lands, free pastures and ears of wheat. Such abundant visions were probably a reflection of environmental change. In distant prehistoric times, both the Nile's flow and the intrusions of the sea into its delta had been so violent as to delete all record of earlier human activity. In 7th millennium BC, for example, the Nile had flowed so fiercely through its delta that it had channeled into a single outflow to the Mediterranean, the so-called Great River, which had run due north from the ending of the valley's limestone cliffs, a process that had desiccated the delta's wetlands and extended the river's length by dropping huge deposits of silt and sand into the Mediterranean, and, with the aid of the prevailing sea currents, had cast up mounds of sand and silt along the shoreline of the river's delta. That fierce flow slowed, however, during the following millennia, and some of the silts which came down in the annual flood had dropped within the river's single stream, dividing it again into half a dozen branches that fanned out into the river's ancient delta lands, reviving marshlands and meanders and watering 100 miles of fertile silt and rush. And it was this that promised the Naqadan herders a leafy paradise rustling with fine game. The first Naqadan settlements in these reviving pasturelands, those established in the middle of the 4th millennium BC, consisted of the usual simple huts set on the gentle alluvial sandbanks typical of the delta landscape, and known today as turtlebacks, sited up above the level of the river's silt. Such settlements offered relatively dry, year-round accommodation within the marshy delta plains, and many of them flourished for centuries, furnished for the most part with the distinctive Naqadan pottery and other imported goods, for there is no native stone or metal in the silty delta. Recent excavations have shown that the settlers had brought the traditional Naqadan technologies of baking and brewing along with them. Despite the striking scenes of Narmer's palette, there is no archaeological evidence of a brutal colonization of indigenous populations on the part of these Naqadan settlers, no communal fortifications, no warrior burials, nor would there have been any strategic or economic reason for such aggression. With the combined populations of both the valley and the delta estimated at 1/3 of a million people, and with a great part of the landscapes of the lower Nile still wild and empty, there was hardly a competition for resources between the two groups. So of the 20 known delta settlements and cemeteries of the Mahdi Budo people, only 5 had Naqadan farming communities founded on the same site, and all of these appear to have been established after their original inhabitants had either left or, perhaps, had adopted the manners and culture of the southern immigrants. Nor does violence of itself appear to have been a natural human response to migrants in the ancient Middle East. Excavations at contemporary Uruk settlements built beside more ancient, well-established communities show a variety of passive cultural exchanges taking place over long periods of time. And in the Nile Delta, too, there is modest evidence of similar processes of selection and assimilation between the southerners and the indigenous inhabitants. Such were the delta's continuing attractions that many of the later pharaohs would pass their lives within it. Harbors and pleasant palaces were erected beside its streams and water meadows, and temples made of imported stone were decorated with fine statues from Upper Egypt, and granite columns floated down the river from Aswan, that the delta's many channels chopped and changed down through the centuries according to the heightened rhythms of the annual flood caused the harbors that gave the pharaohs access to the open sea, and were the ancient Mediterranean's entrepot to Egypt, to Sil, to be abandoned, and then re-established once again beside another, deeper delta stream. And all the while, within this softly tractable environment, rulers hunted duck and wild bulls amongst the rushes and papyrus plants, and farms in Bronze Age factories flourished. Courtiers and craftsmen, shepherds, cowherds and sailors lived side by side with people from the South Levant, Syria, and Crete. And so, today the delta still preserves a part of ancient Egypt different from that held in the more familiar relics from the valley of the Nile. The delta's evidence, therefore, is complementary rather than additional to the usual sources of information about pharaonic Egypt. These were not the dry and literary environments of ritual and death, but fragments of the domestic, cosmopolitan. Day-to-day, caught now in the roots of the spiky grasses that green the deltas. Dusty mounds or lie beneath sweet-smelling fields of clover, onions, beans and lentils. A considerable bonus for Delta archaeologists is that, in comparison to the Naqadan's southern homelands where only the sparse domestic remains have been excavated, the northern settlements are well preserved within its soft and silty strata. Egyptologists have theorized for centuries about the contents of the fabled Delta sites, yet, apart from Flinders Petrie, and a handful of Victorians vainly searching for the cities of the Exodus, there had been more plundering than excavation. Nor is the excavation easy work. The Delta's earth is damp and its remains are often frail, so that their successful excavation requires the skills of modern archaeology rather than the sand shoveling of traditional expeditions. Pioneering work at Delta sites was undertaken in the early 1960s by Egyptian and Austrian archaeologists but was halted by the Arab-Israeli wars, and intensive surveys and excavations have only really been underway in more recent times. Hard-won, and sometimes dug down close to the water table, these typically wide and shallow excavations reveal dun-colored mazes of walls built directly one on top of the other. These are the remains of ancient settlements and towns that today are known by the names of the modern villages which lie close by them, settlements such as Tel El Farqa, Minshat Abu Omar, Tel Ibrahim, Awad, Tel Hassan Davud and Tel El Farain, which is ancient Budo, the Tel and several of these names denoting the presence of a hill that is usually of ancient origin. Such sites, their archaeologists report, show that both indigenes and Naqadans alike had hunted rhinoceros and hippopotami and taken large quantities of fish from the delta's many streams, catfish mostly, and large quantities of freshwater mollusks. The delta's opulent pasturelands had also supported splendid game, so that the pigs caught by the Naqadan immigrants stood a good 6 inches higher than those they had hunted in the valley of the Nile. In similar fashion, the immigrant stocks of cattle, sheep and goats were larger than those within the narrow valley. The southern settlers also harvested the delta's wild grasses and cultivated cereals. Most of the imported flints found in the Naqadan settlements still shine from their contact with stems of ripened wheat. The considerable quantities of husk and other residues of threshing found within the ruins of their settlements, along with the rough-made pottery that the Southerners traditionally made for use as bread molds and beer vats, show that life could have been fairly comfortable. Nor did their tombs' contents differ greatly from those of the southern heartlands, for, though the pottery and stone vessels were sometimes miniaturized, much of their contents had been imported from the south and thus bear the stamp of traditional Naqadan craftsmanship. Into the Levant. The Naqadans did not stop at the Nile Delta. Following in the footsteps of the ancient Madian traders, they also moved into the hinterlands of the south Levant, where the scanty ruins of late Naqadan settlements have been found, containing quantities of flint and ceramic storage jars, whose massive mud silt stoppers still bear the impressions of their sealing, and even, on occasion, a few of the cylinder seals themselves were found close by. By Narmer's time, there were at least 20 of these settlements set now within the coastal plains and hills of southern Israel. They were connected to the Nile's eastern delta by the old Madian trade routes that ran along the Mediterranean littoral, across the top of Sinai and into Palestine, holding both Naqadan and Levantine wares. Some 250 caravan stations and small shelters have been identified along this ancient highway that runs up through the Gaza Strip as far north as the Yarkon River close to Tel Aviv. 3/4 of the ceramics found in these caravan stations were of Naqadan manufacture, which suggests that the traffic on this route was mostly from the lower Nile. At the same time, though, there was a considerable two-way traffic in ideas. Just as some of the buildings in the Naqadan's Levantine settlements were built in Nile Valley style, so too some contemporary Delta settlements show Levantine influence, both in the design of the houses and also and their inhabitants' material possessions. As with the Naqadan's delta sites, there is no evidence whatever that the Levantine settlers had fought to either take or hold the land on which they had come to live. Quite the reverse. The little site of Nahal Tilla/Tel Halif, for example, on the edges of the South Palestine desert, held both Naqadan and local Levantine wares that had been used side by side within the settlement, with a preponderance in some areas of the settlement of one pottery tradition and of the other in other quarters. Here, then, separate Naqadan and Levantine households had lived side by side within the same community, though with little interchange of pottery between the two different cultures. Now, the forms of a household's domestic pottery are the means of its daily life, and they reflect its methods of food storage and preparation, the very food its people ate. It would appear, therefore, that different households in these small, close-knit communities were choosing either one tradition or the other, according to their cultural predilection. So, in a statistical analysis of a heap of potsherds, we discover something of the genuine ethnicity of Naqadan culture. Traces of a living identity consciously maintained and based on hearth and home. Amidst the alien hills of another land, 250 miles from the valley of the Nile, into Nubia. At this same time and in similar fashion, new Naqadan settlements were established to the south of the Naqadan heartlands, in the region between Edfu and Aswan at the Nile's first cataract. Here, their forefathers had long coexisted with the settlements of Nubian cultures whose centers lay far further south. No borders had ever separated these two distinct communities, who, indeed, had shared common origins, both having originally been peripatetic and traveling with herds of cattle. In previous millennia, indeed, the Nubian splendid pottery had often been indistinguishable from the products of the Badarian and early Naqadan kilns, set leapfrog style along the riverbank, one culture following the other. These various cemeteries and settlements ran south from Hieroglyphs into a region where the landscape of itself is a variegated 40-mile strip of geological change, from the familiar verticals of the high, white limestone cliffs to the horizontal ridges of rusty sandstone that begin at Gabel Silsilah and run southwards to the granite boulders of the first cataract at Aswan. Despite the aggressive images in several late Naqadan rock graffiti that were inscribed 200 miles to the south of Aswan at the river's second cataract, there is no evidence of Naqadan settlement south of Aswan. Nor, once again, is there any trace of violence or friction between these two different communities, despite the common modern assumption that the rock graffiti hold militaristic significance. So, in a Naqadan cemetery by modern Cairo, a man who was presumably a Nubian was buried in the manner of his people, his grave provided with a traditional roof burial chamber and marked on the surface of the desert by a distinctive stone circle, in a burial now known, in clunking archaeological parlance, as typical of Nubian group culture, and on the Isle of Elephantine. At Aswan, at the furthest southern point that was navigable by the wooden long boats, some Naqadan settlers were buried with some of their traditional grave goods, and little hollows that the swirling river had sculpted from the granite rocks, though the Naqadan settlers appear to have preferred to use their own distinctive material possessions. The products of their workshops were greatly prized by their southern neighbors. So in the last centuries before King Narmer, some of the largest and most splendid Nubian graves were stocked with Naqadan work of a quality that has only otherwise been found in grand burials at Hierakonpolis and Abydos. Goods, it is usually suggested, that were buried along with local Nubian rulers, excavated by a succession of rescue expeditions, mounted at different times throughout the 20th century, as Lower Nubia was part flooded by the construction of a number of great dams. These graves held many types of object that had not survived within the Naqadan homelands themselves, some splendid incense burners, for example, one unique piece being decorated with an engraved image of a man enthroned upon a large swing-hold boat and wearing a white crown, some pretty little jugs that had been made in The Levant, in which may have been used for carrying imported oils, and a singularly beautiful gold-handled mace, whose decoration has an elegance shared only by such images as those on Narmer's palette. Such imported treasures have traditionally been viewed as evidence of the growing reach and power of a Naqadan proto-state, a scenario of ambition laden with its own implicit narratives, that, for example, the borders of this proto-state must have been secured by violence, as must access to the strategic materials required to construct such vital elements of supply and control as the Naqadans' great wooden boats. Yet in the periods both before and after Narmer, Egypt's borders appear to have been largely undefined, and there is no evidence from either Nubia or the Levant that the late Naqadans were caught up in that militaristic mix of avarice and insecurity that has accompanied the foundation of more recent empires. Nor is there evidence of large-scale trade in or stockpiling of strategic materials such as timber or copper. What actually remains, therefore, what can be seen on the ground in Nubia and the Nile Delta in the South Levant, tokens neither conquest, nor control nor exploitation, but a convivencia, an amiable exchange of technologies and goods following considerable Naqadan resettlement. This was a straightforward extension of that age-old continuum of international exchange and exotic products that ran right through the ancient East, a traffic which, as the beads of the Fayum farmers in the Levantine pottery and the wine cellars of Abydos both suggest, was based on novelty and delight, rather than demonstrating the grim-faced strategic imperatives of an imaginary Naqadan proto-state. The facts on the ground from the centuries before King Narmer show broad movements within various populations with no accompanying evidence of the idea of a national ownership of land, let alone the conscious creation of the boundaries of a kingdom. They show, therefore, that the physical extent of what would later be known as Pharaoh's Egypt was first defined by Naqadan settlement and the communication networks that were established at that time, all along the lower Nile. 14. Taking stock. Ordering and accounting within the early state. In Narmer's day, the hub of his new kingdom was the 60-mile stretch at the narrow ending of the Nile Valley, which, thanks to centuries of immigration, already held more Naqadan graves within it than the ancient burying grounds of Abydos, Hieroglyphs and Naqadan combined, a process that would continue unabated during the reigns of the first kings. Just 25 miles south of Memphis, for example, the necropolis by the village of Kfr Tarkan, one of a dozen sites on the west bank of the river, eventually came to hold 2,000 graves, while the span of Naqadan cemeteries beside the Cairo suburb of Holon, directly opposite the site of ancient Memphis, encompasses the largest known burying grounds in all of ancient Egypt, holding at least 10,000 tombs. Given that these huge cemeteries had probably accommodated the burials of heads of households rather than those of every individual within a community, there's little chance that the fields within that slender strip of river valley could have supplied the produce to support the living community such graveyard populations would imply. This, however, need not have been a cause of hardship. For in later times, as the cemeteries appear to show, the character of the Naqadan's continuing relocations had changed from the modest emigrations of colonizers settling virgin lands to entire households that were not subsistence farmers, and who would be buried in large tombs along with considerable quantities of manufactured and imported goods. Coupled with the decline in the number of burials that took place in the great cemeteries of the Naqadan homelands in the final centuries before the coming of kings, the contents of many of these later tombs suggest that their occupants were participants in various aspects of craft production and supply. This section of Naqadan society, indeed, had long been supported by the farmers and now, more than ever in this narrow strip of land at the valley's ending, had to be sustained by goods and provisions shipped on the river. The fact that in the generations after Narmer these same cemeteries in the region of Memphis continued to accommodate considerable numbers of people who were not farmers suggests that the households of craftsmen and seal holders, those, that is, involved in tithing and court activities, removing lock, stock and barrel out of the Naqadan heartlands. Unlike their copious desert graveyards, few of the settlements of these immigrants have yet been excavated. The contemporary accommodations of the Naqadan communities within the Nile Delta, on the other hand, are yet under excavation, and these show that, like the settlements within the Memphite region, they too had undergone great change. In earlier times, as we have seen, the Delta Naqadans had lived as they had always done within the river's valley, making modest shelters for their harvests and their families. In the last centuries before the kings, however, as non-farming communities were established in the Memphite region, enormous mud brick complexes were built within the delta. Long, low, four-square architectural compounds on top of the gentle mounds that stood above the water meadows, of a size and quality of build unequaled by any contemporary structures yet excavated in the Naqadan heartlands. These later delta settlements were considerable fattery, with warehouses, threshing yards and slaughterhouses, and a complexity of rooms and corridors reminiscent of the temples of the later pharaohs. Here, then, flour was ground and bread was baked, beer was brewed, and fodder stored, and animals were raised and butchered. Now, too, so some cylinder seals and other goods from the settlement's larger graves suggest, factors and managers were living alongside the farmers on these delta estates. Apart from the growing need of the various Memphite communities for continuous supplies of food, these impressive developments within the delta may also have been encouraged by the erratic behavior of the Nile. In the last centuries before King Narmer, some of the annual floods had been so low that temporary buildings erected on the river's floodplain that would usually have been dissolved by the rising floodwaters were preserved, their remains part buried in ancient, wind-blown sand. From Hieroglyphs in the south, to the Fayoum Tel El Farka in the eastern delta, excavators have recorded similar telltale strata, yellow Aeolian sand sandwiched between two dark strips of silt. Strips that by their very thinness show that in these years the river's flood had been mean and low. Within the narrow valley, the early parching of the fields caused by such low floods would have stopped the crops growing to maturity. This precipitous desiccation could, however, be slowed by making extra ditches and embankments to retain the receding waters of the inundation within the river's floodplain. This is still done today in river basins in Ethiopia and Senegal, just as Herodotus recounts in his tale of early Memphis. Just such a project, indeed, also appears to have been described in the generations before King Narmer, in a scene cut in low relief upon a giant mace head. This shows a man with the ubiquitous scorpion engraved beside him and wearing what would become the white crown of Upper Egypt, in the act of opening a water channel with the stroke of a farmer's adze. Though it is hardly proven that this so-called scorpion mace head records an actual event, it is improbable that this unique object, which was found by Quebel and Green in the Great Cache at Hierakonpolis, does not reflect something of the age in which it had been made. Broad and flat, the delta plains would have allowed the convenient conservation of such floodwaters as had come down the river in lean years. Barley, too, which unlike wheat tolerates the dry and salty conditions of a drought, was grown in larger quantities, and, as the ancient Egyptian terms for each of the two crops show, it had a different taste from Nile Valley produce. Yet, there is also evidence that even the delta harvests in those times were hard-won. For the weak inundations appear to have dropped their silt in some of the deltas. Slow-flowing streams, part blocking them and turning water meadows into swamps which, as some of the bones excavated in contemporary delta cemeteries appear to show, encouraged fevers and malaria. Certainly, the delta farmers of those times were less healthy than their compatriots within the Nile Valley. Slip discs and other skeletal features show that many of them were working very hard, and that most were dying in their 30s. No wonder that in those last centuries before the kings a great part of the northward movement of the Naqadan population had stopped so abruptly at the valley's ending. yet the considerable quantities of bread molds and brewing vats found in the ruins of the Delta estates suggest that the settlers were producing food in larger quantities than subsistence settlements would have required. The presence of seals and storage jars within their cemeteries also suggests that, like the imported wine in Tomb Ujayadabitis, their produce was being packaged and controlled. It would appear, therefore, that there were direct and pressing reasons for the establishment of these large, efficient farm estates, and that they had continued to supply the ever-growing settlements at the ending of the rivers valley in a time of decreasing harvests. That considerable quantities of animals were butchered and cooked within these delta farms further suggests that meats and fats were being shipped as well. In later centuries at least, the Egyptians were adept at storing meat and game in jars, preserved under dripping or honey. At this same time too, though life down on the farm may well have been hard, the graves of some of the seal holders on these large estates were as lavishly equipped as some of the larger contemporary tombs in the cemeteries at the ending of the Nile Valley, which once again suggests direct connection, given the absolute dependence of the people settled in the area of Memphis on regular supplies. It is hardly surprising that this unique community developed an obsessive concern with the supply and control of materials and food, an obsession that would dominate the nature and activity of the pharaonic state, down to its very ending. So, in the generations before King Narmer, the mythic city of archaic Memphis may not have been a settlement at all but a gathering of the houses of managers, workers and controllers set beside some shipyards, docks and storage magazines that had been built to develop and maintain Naqadan river traffic, to house and ship the raw materials such as flint and copper that the Delta farms required, and to store the produce gathered from both the Nile Delta and the Rivers Valley for distribution throughout the Memphite communities. And certainly this narrow landing at the ending of the Rivers Valley has proved a perfect place for such an entrepot. Just a few miles to the north of ancient Memphis, modern Cairo still serves something of the self-same function, counting and accounting, with such continuing and pressing reasons for the development of an efficient system of supply. It is hardly surprising that in the last centuries before the coming of the kings, Naqadan culture was, of itself, carefully and deliberately standardized. As René Friedman, one of Hieroglyphs' modern excavators, has described, its wonderfully diverse tradition of ceramics now suffered a striking and complete loss of regional intervariability, a remarkable uniformity of the products of the potter's studios all up and down the lower Nile that would remain throughout the best part of pharaonic history. So the individual ceramic masterpieces traditionally buried with the Naqadan dead quite disappear and are replaced by a small range of utilitarian storage jars that on occasion might be accompanied by a few exquisite dishes and vases cut from desert stone. Clay had become the plastic of the day, the potters making ever larger quantities of wares in ever simpler, regularized shapes, as well as being placed in graves. Some of these practical yet still handsome pots were used in Naqadan households. The larger and more robust vessels, designed for the transportation and conservation of a wide range of commodities, were marked with a range of little images such as scorpions, hawks and sariks, the box-like sign that later came to hold the hieroglyphs of Narmer's name. Like the images engraved upon the ivory tags found in Tomb Ujayadabitis, such pot marks may denote some kind of provenance, an owner, a region or the name of an estate. In truth, however, their significance is yet unknown, as is the order and administration of the traffic that they seem to represent. Yet these powerful little Sarik signs are one of the great historical seductions of this last vague age before the coming of the kings. Swiftly drawn into the clay of storage jars before they were put into a kiln for firing, the image of the Sarik is so frequently found on pots and sherds along the valley of the Lower Nile, through Nubia and the Levant, that to many modern eyes it appears as if it were a logo of late Naqadan internationalism, the mark of the offices of administrators operating a powerful widespread trading system. Now the Sarik sign, as we have already seen, is an image of a compound or a residence, and came to denote, in Narmer's day, the royal name. Buried around 3200 BC, one of the earliest datable examples of a Ceremonial was engraved upon an ivory label in the tomb at Abydos, where it may also have signified a kind of residence, as in the time of Narmer, as might indeed a variety of early Ceremonials. Drawn on a range of surfaces, from cylinder seals to desert cliffs, that many of these Ceremonials are topped by images of hawks, just as they would be in later times. When they enclose one of the 5 names of Pharaoh, might suggest that they also denoted some kind of pre-pharaonic bureaucratic entity. The phantom kings of Dynasty 0, indeed, owe their 15 minutes of prehistoric fame to signs drawn inside some of these prehistoric Ceremonials. Unfortunately, however, there is little more to any of those phantom kings than these signs upon some pots. Do these early Ceremonials, therefore, really advertise archaic governments? Or are they simply a kind of branding, as one might mark a sheep or cow or, indeed, a potter's workshop? With or without such fundamental information, the fact that these early Ceremonials have been found on late Naqadan storage jars from Nubia to the south Levant and in considerable quantity, makes it difficult to imagine that they are anything other than the debris of a consistent pattern of some kind of trafficking. In the modest settlements of the South Levant, for example, Ceremonial pot marks are as common as they are in excavations in the area of Memphis and are often accompanied by jar ceilings impressed with cylinder seals. This further hints that strings of some kind of trading posts were operating within that region. Whatever the realities of the system may have been, and it is neither necessary nor appropriate to turn these ancient pot marks into an empire run by some archaic entrepreneur, the distribution of these marked and standardized storage jars appears to represent not only a trafficking of goods but also the consistent operation of a common system of accounting. They represent, therefore, a traffic, not only in commodities, but also in ideas. And here at last, and most intriguingly, there are indications that, along with their adoption of Mesopotamian design and imagery, and even the Ceremonial itself has Mesopotamian precedents, the Naqadans had also taken up accounting systems, first used in the Jazira and in the Uruk settlements of the Levant. Though frequently described as gaming pieces or unfinished beads, the dozens of pretty little cubes and spheres of semi-precious, semi-polished stones that are often found in excavations at Naqadan sites are equally reminiscent of so-called Mesopotamian tokens. These had been in use for several millennia in the Jazira, where they appear by their quantities and different shapes to have represented a variety of goods and chattels commonly stored in Mesopotamian communities. Now, at about the same time as the Naqadan expansion, the Mesopotamians had also developed a system by which groups of their traditional tokens were encased in balls of clay to create a physical record of a specific group of goods or chattels, which could then be marked on its exterior with the impression of a seal. A somewhat cumbrous form of bookkeeping, it was swiftly augmented by another system of accounting in which frameworks of grids were drawn onto small pillows of soft clay. These compartments were then impressed with the shapes of tokens, so that many different groups of goods were recorded together. A muddy spreadsheet, so it has recently been proposed, that was the origin of writing in the Middle East. Such Mesopotamian grids would have resembled the contemporary grids drawn on sheets of bone and ivory in which the images of the little labels from tomb had been engraved before the individual pieces were snapped apart. The same grid system, with hieroglyphs set into its separate compartments, was also used in some of the first ancient Egyptian tomb reliefs to record lists of tomb offerings. Later, it would be employed to order and contain the accounts of pharaonic temples and a wide range of other records too, from land registers and lists of booty to the accounts of the Memphis shipyards and lists of successive kings. Another residual trace of this prehistoric traffic and mercantile ideas may well be the ancient Egyptian words for numbers such as 6, 7 and 8, which are Levantine in origin, though modern scholars consider such terms integral to the language of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. which they describe as a mix of African and Semitic language groups, a mixture that is, of the ancient languages of northern Africa, of the Levant, Arabia and the Jazira. These Levantine phonetic numerals could well have been introduced along with the Mesopotamian accounting grid centuries before writing was invented or, indeed, before the establishment of kings. Such borrowings, of course, would not have represented a traffic in mathematical abstractions, simply the need in a growing mercantile non-monetary society for a quick and ready method to record groups of objects with a degree of accuracy, the order of the state. Could these faint surviving traces of accounting systems, along with the distribution patterns of the early Syriacs, offer genuine evidence of archaic governments that, in the generations before the coming of the kings, established farms within the Nile Delta and set up trading posts within the South Levant? Though there is no hard evidence of such organizations in the regions of the Lower Nile before the appearance of King Narmer, it is scarcely credible that his great-great palette documents their invention. Courtiers and kings did not emerge one morning like monsters from the swamp. They were not natural phenomena, but products of ancient Naqadan culture and imagination. Like many other of the images on King Narmer's palette, they were also products of a pre-literary age. Exactly similar activities to those shown on Narmer's palette and on other objects that bear his name were certainly taking place long centuries before his time within traditional Naqadan society. At Hieroglyphs, for example, people were being smitten in the manner shown on Narmer's palette 5 centuries before the kings, as we have already seen. There is as well a direct link between King Narmer and that most ancient slaughtering yard, the Oval Court at Hieroglyphs, for objects of Narmer's time were found buried in its floor. By then, however, Naqadan society had completely changed from that represented in the earlier graves in the Naqadan heartlands. The considerable Naqadan communities that were well established in the region of Memphis were members of societies entirely different from those of their farmer forebears and, in similar fashion, the subsistence farmers who first emigrated to the Delta had lived in very different circumstances from those of the estate workers of King Narmer's time. From Aswan to the settlements of the South Levant, all these later Naqadan communities had been joined in a common material culture and in common networks of supply. And so too, they would also have obtained a sense of joint identity that extended well beyond the ancient settlements and culture of the traditional Naqadan heartlands. This is the age that the Narmer palette shows us, not the imaginary creation of an early modern state by force of arms, but a conscious awareness, shared by the officers and craftsmen and the families of King Narmer's court and also, to some extent, by Naqadan communities up and down the Nile, of a brand new order in society, an awareness that they were part of a cultural entity that was greater than any single settlement, part of a single system, also, that covered the entire valley of the lower Nile and beyond and was controlled by a bureaucracy operating in the name of a single person that today, as he is shown and crowned, we call a king. The Egyptologist John Wilson once famously remarked that ancient Egypt was a civilization without cities. This, perhaps, was not so much a sociological analysis as an intuition formed from the impression of the peripatetic nature of the pharaonic court and from the air of comfortable provincialism that the modern eye so easily detects in many of ancient Egypt's relics. Though they controlled a considerable kingdom, from the little group of standard-bearers pictured on Narmer's palette to the families of nobles in fine linens, with their cats and comfy chairs drawn on the walls of innumerable tomb chapels, the pharaohs and their courtiers seem never to have lost the immediacy of human contact, the atmosphere, indeed, of a parish council that found later literary expression in a host of stories in the simple fiction that the monarchs personally controlled the state's activities, underpinning those benign images of government and order, though, beneath that gentle air of feudal domesticity, there was a range of powerful courtly imperatives that were overseen with such determination, such intelligence and efficiency, that just a few centuries after Narmer's time the court could initiate the building of a line of colossal pyramids. At the beginning, the dynamos that drove King Narmer's court were products, and probably, initially, inadvertent products, of the Naqadans. Proclivity for manufacturing and traveling, activities that had first been developed by community potters and metalsmiths, by carpenters and shipbuilders and all of those professions whose hierarchies were derived from the practical imperatives governing their activities. The master potters, for example, overseeing the provisioning and distribution of their studios, the boat captains controlling their vessels voyaging and repair, would all have developed their individual systems of supply and command within the Naqadan heartlands. It is this that was extended by processes of immigration so that, eventually, these archaic networks ran throughout the region of the Lower Nile and into the Levant. Centuries before King Narmer's time, however, and certainly in the time of the owner of tomb Abydos, those fundamental structures were already being overseen by a secondary level of bureaucracy, which controlled the activities of Naqadan trading networks and all of the community's logistic processes beyond the needs of boatmen, potters and subsistence farmers. This was a professional hierarchy that was not itself composed of potters, farmers or boat builders, but which ensured the continuous supply of tools and implements to the Delta estates and undertook the collection and delivery of their produce to the communities in the region of Memphis and whose members were themselves buried in the cemeteries of the Memphite region. Such managers would also have directed the standardization of Naqadan material culture and ensure deliveries of wine and desert stone and other exotica as well as provisions and materials to the shipwrights, the craftsmen and the communities of Memphis. These managers, therefore, would have controlled the living networks of supply, whose traces still survive in mud ceilings and pot marks and in the fragmented records impressed on muddy ceilings and engraved on ivory and bone. They may be considered, therefore, as the seal holders, and, in the times of the first king, as the surviving ceilings found within the tombs still testify. Many of these managers were royal courtiers, and some perhaps, were of the families of the king. Whether or not, in late Naqadan times, these networks of supply were controlled by the phantom princes of Dynasty 0, the Sariks, the Hawks and all the other signs that the potters of that age drew on their wares represent, in some way or other, the diversity of networks for which those Naqadan storage jars were made, the same networks into which, round 3000 BC, King Narmer's name was suddenly introduced. In modern terms, it represents the branding of previously existing systems under a single authority. That Narmer's name appears in greater quantities and in more places than those of all of his supposed predecessors with image names further suggests the integration, the unification, even, of many smaller, previously separated networks, a view borne out by the large numbers of monuments and inscriptions made in the time of Narmer's successors, which would further indicate that the supply systems had not previously been in the hands of a single ruler. This, then, was a brand new order of Naqadan society, in order that the lists of kings engraved upon cylinder seals in the reigns of Narmer's immediate successors tell us began with Narmer's name and received pictorial representation and definition with the objects made in the court workshops. So the numerous images engraved on stone and bone and ivory that show the archaic kings crowned and cloaked and surrounded by an entourage are more than records of events, more even than the lists of tithes that were essential to the existence of their brand new enterprise. For their depictions of state exchange hold the very essence, the very nature of the state itself, whilst the disposal of the court around the king are realizations of the hierarchy it maintained. Exactly this same system was literally laid out in hard, clear lines along the Memphis skyline during the reigns of the kings who followed Narmer to the throne, when an impressive row of mud brick monuments was built to house the graves of some of the king's closest courtier officials. These men and women, so the copious collection of seal impressions gathered from such tombs appear to show, controlled both the estates and the flow of goods that supplied the communities living in the regions surrounding Memphis and the households and flotillas of the royal court. As elaborate and as well built as the contemporary Delta Fattery, these great tombs held models of the granaries and warehouses, the magazines and storage rooms that many of their owners spent their lives in organizing. Some of them, too, had dozens of life-size model bulls' heads set out in rows around them, each one topped with a pair of horns taken from the herds of animals such as were kept on the great estates. In similar fashion, the tomb's internal chambers were storerooms of produce and supplies and held enormous stocks of wood and flint, of copper tools, thousands of standard sealed storage jars, and meat and bread and grain and a range of other produce. Boats were buried alongside several of these monuments, wooden boats with gently swinging hulls such as supplied the estates with farming implements and shipped their produce to the royal court and to the communities at the ending of the valley. These great tombs, with their funeral boats and well-filled magazines, their stores of fine stone vases and their domestic treasures of ivory and exotic woods, show that the centralization of the Naqadan supply systems in the time of Narmer was already creating surpluses of treasure house proportions. At the same time, however, the great row of skyline tombs still stood in the same relationship to the Memphite settlements as had the modest cemeteries of the early Naqadan communities, as part of the public panoply that established the identity and permanence of the living community and offered a continuing connection between the quick and the dead. Now, though, this ancient Naqadan practice, this advertisement of death and burial, was used to give the royal court identity and afterlife, the royal enterprise, the state itself, a powerful and continuing resonance. In time, these same processes would lead to the construction of the pyramids and they, in turn, define the very nature of the mature Egyptian state. 15. The shadows of birds. Rite and sacrifice within the early state. Standing again before the oval of King Narmer's palette, the museum's case A dark, reflecting mirror, brings us sharply to ourselves. Narmer smites, and the evidence of that same act has been excavated in the flesh from a cemetery 5 centuries older than the king. Intimate and violent, the same tableau had been drawn time and again before it emerged, iconic, on Narmer's palette. Later, it became a central image of pharaonic culture. It is an image of a killing king. From the beginning of the kingdom, then, the public panoply of death was used by the royal court in the age-old ways, to reinforce the identity and presence of their community. And on Narmer's palette the king himself literally takes the matter into his own hands. It is not a subject that most modern visions of old Egypt care to entertain, for it is not a part of the ancient Egypt that seems familiar to us, even in the years before the First World War. When Narmer's palette was discovered, most of Quibel and Green's contemporaries had managed to convince themselves, in an extraordinary volte-face, that images of death and execution made in the times of the early kings were the province of the savage, as if the qualities of this savage, which was of itself an invention of mid-19th century anthropologists, had governed prehistoric human mentality. Nor, as we have already seen, is there any evidence that Egypt's so-called unification was a military event. And certainly, the brutal gesture of the king upon the palette is one of formal execution, as practiced at Hieroglyphs, and not of war, which, though it was certainly a living issue to archaeologists at the time of Quibel and Green, appears to have been born as a mythology of heroic national armies, with the words of Homer and the Greeks. After Quibel and Green, the following decades saw the wide adoption of those evolutionary principles of intellectual development so alluringly described by the likes of Freud and Fraser. These held that the primitive that is, the non-Western mind which, they imagined, was expressed in Narmer's palette was the opposite of the scientific mind and close to the world of feeling and to mystical and childish thoughts, where savage passions lurk just beneath the surface. Once again, this was based on the assumption that the behavior of ancient peoples was similar to that of 19th century tribal communities, which had been studied and evaluated by the founding fathers of anthropology. People who often shared the same attitude to their subjects as their colonial administrators, and whose view of their subjects has now become a part of intellectual history. And yet division still prevails. Kings like Narmer are portrayed as living in a time when humans were closer to nature than we are today. In Narmer, the first pharaoh is presented as a primal hero whose killing gesture symbolized the struggle of humanity emerging from the chaos of the primitive world. Thus, everything is explained. Ancient people were automatons with no facility for thoughtfulness, and all you have to do for their explanation is to find the key with which to wind up their imaginary clockwork. As for the early kings, caught in imaginary wars and forever planning for a mumbo-jumbo afterlife, Narmer's gesture is explained as a method of filling his contemporaries with shock and awe. Archaeology, on the other hand, shows that most of Narmer's subjects were practical subsistence farmers, who lived lives similar to those led until quite recently by the majority of people on our planet. And certainly, if we today were set down in the conditions in which the Naqadans had lived and thrived, most of us would surely perish. We may usefully conclude, therefore, that, whatever the imagined savageries and superstitions of these simple people, their communities had practical skills and sensitivities that we today have mostly lost. The Naqadans were as well inventive and discriminating. By Narmer's time, continuous processes of improvisation over considerable periods of time had already led to the invention of hieroglyphic writing, the initiation of a statewide bureaucracy and a royal court. And all of that had been the product of an integrated process in which the Naqadans viewed the things that they were engaged in making in terms as practical as the millennial requirements of subsistence farming. And ever since the foundation of the Oval Court at Hierakonpolis, the organized killing and dismemberment of both animals and people had commanded a great deal of the settlement's resources, a practice that was continued, with some fanfare and in good order, in the times of the first kings. So a body count of Narmer's palette provides a list of 10 people dead and mutilated and 2 who are about to die, and, though the scenes on Narmer's giant mace head appear to show but a single vulnerable figure, bound and squatting in a pose that other images suggest is one of execution, the hieroglyph engraved beneath is a tadpole, which, and later hieroglyphic, signifies 10,000. Other signs, beneath the nearby images of a goat and cow, suggest that they, too, represent considerable numbers. In similar fashion, the scenes of royal assembly on the little picture plaques made in the time of Narmer's successors to the throne show just such slaughterings and executions taking place alongside the presentation of goods and chattels to Pharaoh and his court. More than 100 of these plaques are known to have survived, though most are now in fragments. Translating some of their numerous signs in the manner of the later hieroglyphs, it would appear that some of their images depict specific events, numbering the years of the reign in which they took place, describing the nature and amounts of the goods received, and sometimes even quantifying the slaughter. That plaques have been found at Naqadan and Abydos, and several sites within the Memphis region suggest, as we have already seen, that such oval court assemblies were established in many Naqadan settlements, other than Hierakonpolis. Some specific details on a few of them, indeed, allow the tentative identification of one of their locations as Budo in the northern Nile Delta, where one picture plaque shows a local shrine with an enclosure standing close to the court of ceremonies. It would appear, therefore, that settlements and estates all along the lower Nile delivered part of their annual yield, alive and dead, to the enthroned figure at the center of these gatherings, and at that same time people were sometimes stabbed and scalped and maced to death in the old Naqadan ways, and that bulls, as the picture plaques occasionally show, were held up to collect their blood. Such insistently recorded butchery brings back to mind the Naqadans' magnificent flint knives. Though fragile, some of the later specimens were designed to accommodate a handle so that they could be grasped in the manner of modern knives and employed for sterner tasks than that of flaying or of slicing meat. A dozen or so of these handles have survived. That they are of polished ivory, decorated on occasion with fine designs and covered with sheets of shining gold, suggests that they were intended for display. That one of them shows rows of bound and kneeling prisoners accompanied by guards on one of its faces and a settlement shrine upon the other, further suggests that some of them, at least, were the tools of human sacrifice. Tithe and ceremonial. Taking life at funerals had been common in the Nile Valley from the time of the first farmers. Animals were often killed and buried in the cemeteries, and butchered, cooked and eaten at the grave. By early Naqadan times, it would appear that people, too, were being killed and buried with the dead, for multiple burials are common in the cemeteries of the time, and it is difficult otherwise to explain how several bodies could have been simultaneously interred within a single grave without such killings. At the same time, as we have seen, some of the Naqadan dead were dismembered at the time of their funeral, their body parts laid out in careful patterns with the funerary goods. At least 5% of Naqadan burials show evidence of post-mortem butchery. These deathly dramas appear to have declined from around 3500 BC, when images of wooden boats appear at Hieroglyphs. At this same time there was as well a growing preoccupation with the protection and physical preservation of the dead throughout the Naqadan heartlands, with increasing numbers of burials placed in coffins and set inside brick-lined burial chambers. Techniques were also introduced that would later be elaborated to become the complex processes of pharaonic mummification. Resin-soaked linen cloths were placed round some of the Naqadan dead to turn flesh and bone into a solid, long-lived image. Now, too, the goods which had traditionally been buried with the dead were changing. The splendid pottery, household goods, plates of food and remnants of cemetery feasts replaced by a few stone vases and provisions, stored, for the most part, in the same types of ceramic jars that the Naqadans were trafficking along the Lower Nile and into the Levant. At Hieroglyphs, the prime locale of the Naqadans' interchange between life and death was moved from the desert cemeteries to the oval court close by the settlements in the river bank, and it remained in sporadic use down to the time of Narmer. In those last years, when the settlement that had once surrounded it had moved away and some of the courtyard's installations were covered with wind-blown sand, traces of new-built mud brick walls and fragments of fine stone vases among the derelictions show that it was restored for the last time. That this work was undertaken to serve some kind of rite or presentation at the oval court is suggested by the findings of the archaeologists who in the 1990s succeeded Michael Hoffman in its excavation. They uncovered a cache of exotic objects made in Narmer's time which had been smashed up and buried in a pit dug in the courtyard floor. The pottery in this cache was the key to its understanding, alongside some clever antiquarian imitations of the lustrous black-topped Naqadan wares of earlier ages, and some exceptional pieces imported from the Nile Delta and the South Levant, were sherds of locally made jars whose elaborate forms were similar to those of later hieroglyphs that designate words like praise and libation. Thus, some of the pottery in this rich cache could be identified as an early type of the so-called Hesphaes later used in rituals performed in the great pharaonic temples. A further indication that it was indeed the residue of a rite or ceremony was the presence of a rounded pot whose form had only previously been known from a drawing of just such a vessel shown standing in the forecourt of a shrine, a detail from part of the engravings on Narmer's mace head which was also found at Hieroglyphs, and which had itself formed part of the deposit that contained King Narmer's palette. Nor was this the sole connection between the cache of objects from the oval court and the enormous deposit excavated by Quibell and Green. Both locales clearly held the residues of ceremonial or ritual activities, while some of the great mass of objects recovered bore clear comparison to more modest groups of objects since recovered in the excavation of archaic shrines at Abydos, at Aswan. and in some of the Naqadan's delta settlements. Composed of figurines of animals and humans, and made in a variety of materials, these caches were usually accompanied, as they were at Hierakonpolis, by flint knives and incense burners, by heads faces and by exotic pots and dishes. All of them, therefore, appear to have been the residues of ritual activities in some, at least, so the images from King Narmer's time quite clearly show, were part of courtly pageantry. We may imagine, then, by combining the archaeology and the scenes on the picture plaques, a grand flotilla arriving at settlements such as Budo, Naqadan or Hierakonpolis and setting up a court inside an especially designated area, where the king was enthroned upon a plinth, and various scenes of tithing, butchery and presentation unfolded underneath him, that vivid mix, in short, that, tempered, sanctified and bejeweled, was the essence of the pharaonic enterprise. Enacted throughout the networks on which King Narmer stamped his name, by their very repetition such awful tableaus must have taken on the qualities of a theatrical or liturgical event. The first kings would also take the act of killing back into the cemeteries, so that the line of courtly tombs on the horizon of Saqqara and other grand contemporary tombs were framed by rows of smaller graves, the burials of craftsmen and other servants, killed apparently at the time of funeral and buried on occasion, along with herds of bulls, with the gathered wheat and wine from the great estates and with some of the finest products of the royal workshop stash. Exactly that same mix, in fact, which had so enlivened presentations at the living court. And so the networks of the early state were extended to include the generations of the living and the dead, and the centrality of death and butchery. And the Naqadan tradition had continued resonance in pharaonic culture. Death, indeed, came to define its very limits. The pyramids, the tombs of pharaohs, were set on its horizon, and every major temple possessed offering altars in a slaughterhouse, with the delineation of a single, awful gesture, Narmer's. Craftsmen had encompassed the essentials of pharaonic government in those last years, when the settlement that had once surrounded it had moved away and some of the courtyard's installations were covered with wind-blown sand, traces of new-built mud brick walls and fragments of fine stone. Vases among the derelictions show that it was restored for the last time. That this work was undertaken to serve some kind of rite or presentation at the Oval Court is suggested by the findings of the archaeologists who in the 1990s succeeded Michael Hoffman in its excavation. They uncovered a cache of exotic objects made in Narmer's time which had been smashed up and buried in a pit dug in the courtyard floor. The pottery in this cache was the key to its understanding, alongside some clever antiquarian imitations of the lustrous black-topped Naqadan wares of earlier ages, and some exceptional pieces imported from the Nile Delta and the South Levant, were sherds of locally made jars whose elaborate forms were similar to those of later hieroglyphs that designate words like praise and libation. Thus, some of the pottery in this rich cache could be identified as an early type of the so-called Hesphase later used in rituals performed in the great pharaonic temples. A further indication that it was indeed the residue of a rite or ceremony was the presence of a rounded pot whose form had only previously been known from a drawing of just such a vessel shown standing in the forecourt of a shrine, a detail from part of the engravings on Narmer's mace head which was also found at Hierakonpolis, and which had itself formed part of the deposit that contained King Narmer's palette. Nor was this the sole connection between the cache of objects from the Oval Court and the enormous deposit excavated by Quibell and Green. Both locales clearly held the residues of ceremonial or ritual activities, while some of the great mass of objects recovered bore clear comparison to more modest groups of objects since recovered in the excavation of archaic shrines at Abydos, at Aswan, and in some of the Naqadan's delta settlements. Composed of figurines of animals and humans, and made in a variety of materials, these caches were usually accompanied, as they were at Hierakonpolis, by flint knives and incense burners, by heads faces and by exotic pots and dishes. All of them, therefore, appear to have been the residues of ritual activities in some, at least, so the images from King Narmer's time quite clearly show, were part of courtly pageantry. We may imagine, then, by combining the archaeology and the scenes on the picture plaques, a grand flotilla arriving at settlements such as Budo, Naqadan or Hieroglyphs and setting up a court inside an especially designated area, where the king was enthroned upon a plinth, and various scenes of tithing, butchery and presentation unfolded underneath him, that vivid mix, in short, that, tempered, sanctified and bejeweled, was the essence of the pharaonic enterprise. Enacted throughout the networks on which King Narmer stamped his name, by their very repetition such awful tableaus must have taken on the qualities of a theatrical or liturgical event. The first kings would also take the act of killing back into the cemeteries, so that the line of courtly tombs on the horizon of Saqqara and other grand contemporary tombs were framed by rows of smaller graves, the burials of craftsmen and other servants, killed apparently at the time of funeral and buried on occasion, along with herds of bulls, with the gathered wheat and wine from the great estates and with some of the finest products of the royal workshop stash. Exactly that same mix, in fact, which had so enlivened presentations at the living court. And so the networks of the early state were extended to include the generations of the living and the dead, and the centrality of death and butchery. And the Naqadan tradition had continued resonance in pharaonic culture. Death, indeed, came to define its very limits. The pyramids, the tombs of pharaohs, were set on its horizon, and every major temple possessed offering altars and a slaughterhouse, with the delineation of a single, awful gesture, Narmer's craftsmen had encompassed the essentials of pharaonic government, sacred and profane. At first glance, Freud's and Fraser's notions of the primitive mind provide us with a simple explanation of what was really happening within those oval courts. The slaughterer's contact with death, in which his victim stood as intermediary, had transformed him into a magician priest in direct contact with the dead. So, the office of the king, in whose name the slaughterer had worked, became a sacred office, in tithing at the royal court, which ensured the welfare and continuity of the state, was transformed into a sacred ceremonial of offering that ensured a so-called cosmic continuity in a savage and chaotic universe. In reality, however, there is no evidence at all that rites conducted in the oval courts were undertaken in a religious context, or even that they held some kind of symbolism. Centuries later, when Pharaoh's scribes first found a voice, they described some of these age-old rites in tableaus, and in those writings there are the first literary intimations of the king's divinity. In the silent and archaic age of the first pharaohs, however, before the scribes composed their verses, before the artists of the courts drew kings in company with gods, there are just burials and bones, silent objects, images and architectures, and the sparest traces of a network of tithing and supply operating all along the lower Nile. Taken all together, this evidence suggests that the early kings were commanding rites that had previously been performed within the oval courts and, earlier still, within Naqadan cemeteries. Rites that were conducted under the heavy halo of real, bloody and emotive dismemberment and death. Rites that reinforce the identity of the archaic court in the same way they had for earlier communities of farmers, at times of funeral. Nor, in this silent world, should we bother much to differentiate between the sacred and profane. The ancient Egyptians seldom did so, such navel-gazing, as a later Egyptian caustically observed, came with the Greeks. As for the subjects of the early kings, their tools and their utensils, their burials and boats, their drawings and their architectures all hold their own intelligence, their own integrity, the imperatives that were the very order of their world. So if a modern definition of religion, or indeed of art, is that it gives meaning to objects beyond the utilitarian, then it is better to leave King Narmer's palette and the relics of the oval courts and the pyramids and temples of old Egypt outside such discussions. For if such things were made in the conscious service of the sacred, As far as Pharaoh's kingdom was concerned, it was a necessary sacredness. And still today in the Egyptian countryside, just as they appear upon the shrieks of the early kings, hungry hawks sit high up on the walls of village stockyards above the butcher's block, and look down upon the living world below with round, unblinking eyes.